This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Over the past few weeks, Justin Trudeau has survived confidence votes from the Conservatives. They tried to overthrow his government. This past week, it was a pitch from the inside, an internal coup of rebel Liberal MPs trying to oust Justin Trudeau as the Liberal leader and the Prime Minister. So it would sound like he's a man in control, and yet Parliament is completely dysfunctional and the Liberals can't pass any bills or move their agenda. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host, and I can honestly say that in more than 20 years of covering Parliament, I'm struggling to think of a more tumultuous time. A prime minister under attack from within and without, a government that can't function, a major diplomatic spat with India, crime on the rise, an electorate upset about the economy, and ready to move on from a government lost in dismal polling. And yet Justin Trudeau carries on, seemingly unscathed, unbowed. To try and make some sense of this, I'm joined by another longtime watcher of politics, a man who has long walked the corridors of power in Ottawa, National Post columnist John Ivison. John, thanks for the time.
Hi, Brian.
You've been through some weird times on the Hill. We arrived up there around the same time, I believe. So, the Paul Martin switch over to Stephen Harper, confidence votes that weren't confidence votes, various plays for power. Do you remember anything quite like this?
Well, I mean, it dysfunctional, absolutely, no question. At the end of the day, Wednesday, which was built up as this potential very dramatic event, was very anticlimactic. Nothing really happened, or certainly nothing in public.
It was a wet squib.
It was a bit of a damp squib. But for drama, there was nothing like the spring of 2005, which I'm sure you were there covering it when Paul Martin brought Belinda Stronach into the National Press Theatre and unveiled former Conservative leadership candidate as a new Liberal MP
and minister,
in fact, even as a cabinet minister. And then that vote in the House, where it was a non-confidence vote, and Harper was trying to bring down the Martin government, and it all rested on one independent MP, Chuck Cadman, former Conservative MP, who kind of languidly stood up and voted with the government and ended hopes of a spring election in 2005, which, with hindsight, was probably a good thing for Harper. He might not have won that election, and he subsequently won the following January. So for pure drama, I haven't seen anything like that. But this at the moment, I mean, not a great surprise. I mean, I think that governments, they seem to survive storm after storm after storm, and people assume that they haven't been damaged by those storms, such as the SNC Lavalin affair in 2019. But all that bad publicity and the draining of goodwill, it's like a reservoir. It kind of stacks up behind the reservoir, and at some point the dam bursts. And I think we're seeing that happening right now.
Talk about this coup for a minute. So it was a failure. I had predicted it would be a failure. In fact, I said just days before it happened, they'll be lucky to get more than 24. And then, all the reporting out of it is that it was exactly 24 MPs. There had been estimates of as many as 60. These guys could not put their name to this. And that's something that bothered me, because you look at when the Paul Martin guys tried to take out Chrétien, and then eventually did, they at least said, here we are. Here's who we are. This is why we want change. You've got a group of people who wouldn't even give the names of those who had signed the letter to Justin Trudeau. What does that say about them? Trudeau's very low in popularity, and they can't stand up to him. What does that say to you?
Well, I'm not sure that the coup has failed. I mean, what was the quote about the French Revolution? The Chinese statesman who said he was asked what the impact of the French Revolution was, and he said, well, it's too early to say. And I don't think that this is over yet. I mean, you've got 24 MPs who made it known to the Prime Minister their identity, at least in behind closed doors. I think possibly more damaging is that while there are people who are loyal, 100% loyal to Justin Trudeau, I think the bulk of the Liberal caucus, if they were given a secret ballot, would not vote in his favour. And so if we go to a secret ballot, then I think he's done for. Now, I think he will try everything in his power to stop that happening. But here's another potential scenario. The refuseniks, the 24 MPs who wanted him out, gave him until October
28th.
28th, I think, 28th. The next day is the Bloc Québécois deadline, which they've said if certain measures are not enacted, which don't appear to be coming, then the consequences will fall where they may, which makes it sound like they will vote with the Conservatives on a non-confidence vote. When Ken MacDonald, one of the refuseniks or dissidents, was asked on his way to caucus, he said voting against the government on a non-confidence vote was an option. Now, even if those 24 MPs abstained and didn't vote with Poilievre and Blanchet, it would come down to 4 independent MPs. I did the math. There would be 156 if the Liberals minus the dissidents plus the NDP voted against that motion, especially if you include the 2 Greens. There would be 152 if the Bloc sided with the Conservatives and 24 abstained. You're down to 4 independent MPs. If some of those dissidents voted for the non-confidence motion, we've got an election. So, they were very vague about what the consequences were, but I'm not quite sure that that it meant that it didn't have a follow-up plan. I mean, another thought on that is that many of these people are not running again. So for them, they want to get on with their lives.
Ken MacDonald, they're not running again. Someone like Patrick Weiler from Vancouver, I believe he is. But
right. So, but let's say there's a good percentage of that 24 who are not running again. They don't want to be hanging around for another year. They probably would quite welcome an election soon, and then they can move on with their lives.
So you think there's a possibility that this week or in the coming weeks we could be looking at an election?
I think if you're relying on the NDP, that's not going to happen. I don't think the NDP they always flatter to deceive. I don't think they have enough money in their coffers yet. I don't think the polling is quite there for them yet. So I don't think they're going to abandon the government in a non-confidence vote yet. But if those 24 dissidents decide, right, we were just ignored, Trudeau has just ploughed on regardless, then we might see consequences for sure. I would say, MacDonald said on his way into caucus, he's got to start listening and he's got to show signs that he's prepared to bend a little bit to what people want. And then the next day, we saw Trudeau coming out with the Immigration Minister, Mark Miller, and actually reversing himself, which was quite a major reversal on immigration, to say they were going to cut immigration numbers and admit that they hadn't got the balance right when it came to bringing in new Canadians.
As you pointed out in your column, as did I, in mine, they tried to lay the blame everywhere else on that. They tried to say, well, we didn't get the balance right, but it was due to those nasty, greedy corporations and those post-secondary education institutions. And don't forget those provincial governments, none of whom, by the way, can authorize a single solitary visa to enter the country.
Right. I mean, I think corporations did put heavy pressure and exaggerated the problem. And there was a very real problem with Labour at that time. The Bank of Canada Monetary Policy Report came out this week and suggested that 50% or more of companies could not hire people at the wages they wanted to pay. Now, companies never want to pay, higher wages. And this was a means not only of companies getting cheap labour, it was a means for the government to try to suppress inflation, because they would keep wage demands down by bringing in cheap labour. So there was an element of that.
That's something that even Mike Moffat, an economist, an academic who has advised this government on multiple different roles over the years, even he said that this was an attempt to reduce and suppress wages. Yep.
I think there's no doubt about that. So there was that. I mean, clearly, colleges and universities want more foreign students because they pay exorbitant fees. So I'm sure there was an element of that, and clearly, some of these things setting up in.
But they have the ability to say yes or no.
Right, but there is a big but, and the but is it's the government that sets the rules.
Yeah,
and they, despite being warned by the public service, we know that the public service warned in briefings that there would be unintended consequences to this, and they ploughed ahead with it. I mean, it's remarkable to me that Sean Fraser is being mooted as a potential leadership candidate. His fingerprints were all over this. He was the guy who ignored the warnings about unintended consequences. Miller, who I think is an able and a sort of admirably candid minister, he said yesterday, we should have acted sooner, and there was an impact on housing prices.
He was pretty blunt in that.
Fraser was the guy who did it.
And you're right, he's being touted as a leadership candidate. Well, we'll get to that part in a minute, but I saw this yesterday or the other day, and then, of course, Trudeau's out trying to take credit for a drop in auto thefts. He was touring York Region Police Detachment on Friday to talk about that. Of course, auto thefts are down. They're not down to where they were before the huge spike, but they're able to say, okay, they're down a little bit. Are we starting to see the beginning of Justin Trudeau starting his David Eby moment, where he starts campaigning against himself in an attempt to win re-election?
Yeah, well, I think there's nothing consistent about what they are doing, and I mean, it would not surprise me if he is forced to retreat on the consumer carbon price. I mean, it seems to me that if he is going to win back some of these MPs, and a lot of the MPs are rural MPs like Ken MacDonald, then he would have to at least pause the consumer carbon tax, which, I mean, I've argued in favour of it as the most market-oriented way to reduce emissions, if that's your goal. And Canada is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which says we are going to do our bit to reduce emissions. So if you believe in honouring your commitments and you believe in reducing emissions, this is the best way to do it. But it's political kryptonite, and everybody's recognised that from the NDP to Mark Carney, that this is just not sellable anymore. So it would not surprise me if Trudeau's ultimate reversal and ultimate campaigning against himself would be at some point to pause that, if not scrap it entirely.
Well, I think it'd be incredibly difficult for them to scrap it, perhaps pause. But this is a government that, although I was about to say they've attacked anyone who's been against this policy, but they had previously called anyone who advocated the policy that they announced on immigration a racist and anti-immigrant. Right. So maybe they could turn around and go towards a policy that they had previously said, if you don't believe in this, then you don't believe in climate change and you want the planet to burn. It was just a week or so ago, they were saying that if you don't have a carbon tax, you can't trade. And I thought, our biggest trading partner doesn't have a carbon tax. And by the way, their emissions are actually headed in the right direction. So There's more than one way to deal with it. And they've said, if you don't do it our way, you're against the planet. And so for them to reverse it, they would be going in the direction that they had previously denounced.
But Trudeau was the guy who fatally, in my opinion, undermined the integrity of the consumer carbon tax when he exempted home heating fuels for political reasons.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, if you can do that, then why can't you then extend a pause or an exemption for all other fuels for a period of time for political reasons? The logic suggests that you could do exactly that.
Do you think that would be enough to turn the Liberal fortunes around? You and I have been around the game long enough to know that a week's a long time in politics. A year is an eternity. So if we were to make it to next year, I've long said, Conservatives would be foolish to think that the polls that they have now will be the polls they have come election time. And in my discussions with people like Pierre Poilievre and Jenny Byrne, they say they understand that. But is this enough to turn it around, or are Trudeau and his team at the point that all governments will eventually get to, which is that voters are tired of you? They're sick of your face.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think all the polling history suggests that when you're 20 points behind and the time for change number is at 70, 80, even upwards of 80%, then you're just tuned out. I mean, I think the Liberal Party as a brand could stage a recovery by concentrating on the services that they might claim Poilievre will kill, from pharmacare to dental care to daycare, whatever. I mean, the polls suggest people like those social services, particularly dental care and daycare. And that if you kill them, that's not going to be popular. And I think Poilievre, they're obviously looking at that polling and thinking, what can we keep? What can we get rid of? But it's a different matter when it's Trudeau saying it. And I remember Tom Flanagan, the political scientist, many years ago saying that attacks from politicians are discounted by voters if the source of the attack is less popular than the target. And that's absolutely the case right now. And so whatever Trudeau says, it seems to be, is tuned out by the electorate. So even when he's making points that I think should be scoring with voters who are concerned about some of these social programs, and there's no doubt, if you look at the numbers, it would be very hard for Poilievre to do all that the Liberals are doing, balance the budget, and spend another 20 billion or so on defence, which I think he's committed to. So something's got to give somewhere. And I think there's a legitimate avenue for the Liberals, but not for Trudeau.
So it would have to be a different messenger. The thing, though, is, we had a story the other day about the expansion of the executive ranks. They've gone up by 42% since Trudeau took office. In
the public service,
just of the executive ranks of the public service, yes, and then the greater public service, it's up 41 or 43% in that range. The amount of services that we get from government is not up by that much. That's well above inflation. That's well above inflation and population growth. So there is a bloat that I think could be cut without damaging any services that Canadians actually want from their government. But I think that would still lead to a big fight. You could absolutely trim the civil service, especially in Ottawa, and no one would notice except those getting laid off. But that would lead to an awful lot of conservative parties cut. You can't trust them. There would be a big fight. I mean, this is the whole reason that Doug Ford is contemplating an early election in Ontario. He doesn't want the headache of going to his own voters in the middle of a bunch of Poilievre budget cuts. So would Poilievre be able to find that and survive and still deliver those services? Because I think you're right. Cutting seniors' dental care will not be popular.
Well, I think you start a new government with a bank of political capital, and you decide what you're going to spend it on. And there's no doubt that they're going to cut consultancy spending, for example, which is $20 billion. So you could probably save a lot of money there. Cutting the bureaucracy sounds great, and everybody does it. Everybody says they're going to do some of it, except obviously the Trudeau government, which has added, gazillions to. But actually doing it, I mean, you're taking on the public sector unions. It is a big fight. And is that where you want to spend your capital in your first year in government? I'm not sure that is going to be the principal target when they come in. I mean, pharmacare has not really rolled out yet. That's probably a good one to stop in its tracks.
Well,
dental care is pretty going to be.
They don't have any deals with the provinces. Dental care is set up, but
dental care set up. I think they and I remember I talked to Ken Bosenkohl quite recently, former Harper advisor, and he said it's a kind of interesting model. Dental care. It's kind of a public-private hybrid. And that might appeal to some conservatives. You've essentially got private provision of a public program, so they could probably rationalize that and keep it. I think they'd be kind of mad to kill that in their first year. It probably wouldn't.
If they were smart, they would cut deals with the provincial programs that already exist, because the problem I've heard from dentists and dental associations is that the federal government duplicated a program that the provinces have, and they've made it more cumbersome and more difficult to administer. So, get rid of the administration side, partner with the provinces. The costs are down significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people do not care who's providing the service or who's even paying for it, as long as the service is maintained. I mean, taking things away is hard. Taking things away that people are used to is hard. So where he finds the money is not clear. But I don't think they can possibly do all the things that they've pretty much said they're going to do without making some pretty major cuts. And that is an avenue for the Liberals.
Let me close this segment, and we'll come back after a break and talk about where the Liberals go from here. But let me close this segment by asking you, does Pierre Poilievre keep his promise to defund CBC English, or does he walk away from that?
I don't think there's any way he can walk away from that. I mean, that has been a constant since he declared his interest in the leadership. I think by conviction, he wants it done. Now, how exactly it would look, whether it would be fully defunding it, I don't know. But it seems to be that one is extremely popular with the base, and you just can't mess with it.
And even when you look at polling outside of Conservatives, there are an awful lot of people who say, we don't need it anymore. It's a different world.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that.
So that will be interesting. We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, we will talk about where the Liberal Party goes from here. Is there a path forward for them? The absolute paralyzation of Parliament, and who are the contenders to replace Justin Trudeau? More in moments. Since the beginning of October, the House of Commons actually hasn't done anything except debate their own existence, their own privilege. There's been no government business going on. The House is actually paralyzed. It's an issue that I don't think has gotten enough attention. John, I know that you've said to me that you don't spend a lot of time focused on the House, but what does it tell you that the Trudeau government can't actually even move forward their Ways and Means motion to change the capital gains tax because they have to spend all the time talking about the privilege being breached because they won't hand over documents in this so-called green slush fund scandal?
Yeah, I think for most Canadians, this will just be a lot of noise. They pay 3 seconds a week to what goes on in politics, less to what goes on in Parliament. It is a sign of the times that it's completely dysfunctional. In some ways, it hardly matters because the government's legislative agenda is so thin. There's very little out there that is still outstanding, which would mean that a prorogation would not be disastrous from the government's point of view. They don't have a lot of legislation that would then have to start all over again.
They would just be hammered for coming back on September 16th, and 5-6 weeks later, it'll be portrayed as you don't want to work.
Right. But at the same time, from the government's point of view, you forestall confidence motions. And, any day when Parliament is sitting is not a good day for the government. It essentially gives the opposition the platform to hammer them in question period. So you got to weigh the pros and the cons. I mean, obviously there are still things like the capital gains tax that are still pending. So that would be a consideration. But, I think it's almost inconceivable to me that we could stagger on for almost another year before an election in this mode.
Yeah, so for people that don't follow that closely, the House of Commons voted and demanded that the government hand over documents in the Sustainable Technology Fund, the Green Slush Fund. They refused. They've given some documents. They've withheld others. They've redacted lots. And so the Speaker ruled you've got to give them, and Parliament has the right to vote to demand them. And the government just refused. Once they deal with that, John, they then have to deal with the second question of privilege, which is Randy Boissonnault and the other Randy that was doing business with his old business partner while he's in cabinet, and that business that he was a part of was doing business with the government. So, right. I mean, I don't know how they don't just stop it all and try and shut things down.
Well, they may well do. We've got a fiscal update coming at some point, but I don't think the government can afford to spend much more money and maintain the targets that it set in the last budget. So it's a real mess, and it does feel like the end of days. I mean, logically, parties don't go to an election if it's not in their interests, i.e. the polling isn't working for them, and if they're short of cash. And I think in both those cases, there's not a convincing case yet for the NDP.
Prorogation is something they probably should have done back in June. I was talked to some very smart Liberals who say they don't understand why their party didn't do that. The House came to an end of the spring session in June. They could have prorogued the House then and said, we'll be back in the middle of September, come back at the same time. But that would have shut down the House committees that spent all summer just dragging up more clips for social media on the government's problems with ArriveCan, with the Green Slush Fund, with all of these things, just causing more headaches. They didn't do that. They didn't come back with a new agenda. It really feels like Justin Trudeau and Katie Telford and the rest of the Brain Trust are out of ideas and out of gas.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, your point about Parliament being a kind of backdrop for social media content, I mean, I think that's what it's become. It's rarely engaging. There's no real debate. It's just people thinking about clips. And very rarely are those clips favorable to the government. So, yeah, I'm equally bamboozled. I mean, when you do things like prorogation, as Harper did in 2008, you take heat for it for a few days, and then people forget all about it. And generally, it seems to me, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages.
Well, so if they had prorogued in June and said, we'll be back in September with the speech from the throne, that's not shutting down early. And that's a fairly standard way of doing prorogation. And Trudeau had previously shut down to avoid the We Charity scandal. And he only took a little bit of heat from that. I think in this case, though, I think he would take more heat.
Well, he could turn around and say, look, the opposition have combined to mean that we can't get anything done. I mean, essentially, that was his excuse for an election, I guess the 2021 election, that Parliament was dysfunctional. Well, Parliament has never been more dysfunctional than it is right now.
Well, one of the words that I got coming out of the Liberal caucus meeting last week was, in addition to the whole coup thing, was one of the instructions given to Liberal MPs was go forward and filibuster at committee. So the thinking is make it seem even more dysfunctional so that they have no choice but to shut down.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, that might be where we end up. It's intriguing to me that before Parliament returned, Jagmeet Singh made great play about ripping up this agreement with the Liberals, and yet they have been joined at the hip ever since. I mean, in committees, they work in concert. On votes, they work in concert. It's as if it didn't happen.
You may recall that several journalists, myself included, tried to ask Jagmeet Singh, is it more than 24 times at that news conference? Right. Does that mean you don't have confidence? And he refused to say. He tried to dodge it. You've written extensively on Canada's relationship with India and how the Trudeau government has dealt with this issue. And you've even said that it looks like they're trying to set up for a national security election. Do you think that's what part of this whole Pierre Poilievre won't get a security clearance issue is all about? Like, I think it's a ridiculous argument saying he's got to get a security clearance and see what we know, because Trudeau hasn't acted. Jagmeet Singh hasn't acted. Nothing's changed, and they've read the report. I don't believe that anything would change if Poilievre read the report. You're not allowed to act on the information. But do you think the combination of this attack against Poilievre and the way that Trudeau's handling India is all about a narrative for whenever the next election is?
Well, I think everything in the Trudeau government is about a narrative. The idea of a national security election was Wesley Wark, the academic. Wasn't my own thought, and I'm not sure it would be. I think it would be a carbon tax election, not a national security election.
Well, we know Poilievre wants a carbon tax election. Right. He said so. Even in response to Trudeau's immigration changes.
Yeah, I think Trudeau wouldn't mind a focus being on leadership. And in this case, he's pointing to the fact that Poilievre has not got the clearance. I think if I was Poilievre, I would get the clearance, and that just takes it off the table. It's not entirely clear to me why he doesn't get it, because I think many people do get security clearance and are still able to talk about sensitive issues. I mean, Trudeau, as it turns out, Trudeau didn't get security clearance. He just became Prime Minister and got it automatically.
Yeah, you don't go through a screening process when you're Prime Minister,
which is kind of crazy. But yet he still managed to speak at the Foreign Interference Commission or inquiry about sensitive issues. In fact, he disclosed what he and Modi talked about. I mean, and what could be more damaging to national security than disclosing what you talked about in private with another world leader? I do think that he is using this as a distraction. I think the Liberal government's policies on India over the last 9 years have contributed to where we are. Although I do recognise you can't have foreign agents running amok in your country, killing citizens, and not act on it. I just think the way that Joe Biden has handled it in the States, and that the way that the law enforcement in the United States has handled it, is much better advised than what Trudeau has done, standing up in the House of Commons and making a political issue about it.
So Joe Biden and the Biden administration, they've laid charges. Somebody is facing charges over what's happened. In Canada,
And the indictment was unsealed last week, and it is grim reading. I mean, that's how you do it. You arrest the people, and then you make public the evidence. We've done it precisely the opposite direction.
Well, and then when Trudeau was on the stand at the Hague Commission, the Foreign Interference Commission, he admitted that he made the accusation before he had evidence. He said, well, we had intelligence, but it wasn't evidence yet. And yet you're making this grand pronouncement against an ally. It's obviously one that he wants to campaign against. I find this so perplexing and so bothersome that Indian domestic politics is now Canadian domestic politics, that Justin Trudeau feels that the best way for him to stay in power is to pitch at the Sikh community, and in particular the small bit that is very motivated by the Khalistan movement, and campaign against a foreign prime minister who is not well liked by the Sikh community. And I get Modi runs a Hindu nationalist government. I get there's problems with that, but you're bringing in India's domestic problems to Canadian domestic politics, and it's not going so well.
I mean, it is, you used the word perplexing. I'm perplexed at how last week went, that, we go through Thanksgiving and then suddenly the Mounties have a press conference. Without revealing the evidence, they say they're trying to break this chain of violence, which I'm sure is real. But the timing of the RCMP press conference without putting out the evidence was perplexing to me. And then 2 or 3 days later, there's Trudeau on the stand. He's completely changed the channel from this internal coup. And he's now on the attack about foreign interference in the Conservative caucus, about the leader not having security clearance, and is trying to shape the election question about leadership.
He completely used a very serious issue, the Foreign Interference Commission, as a wedge. He threw all kinds of attacks at Pierre Poilievre while testifying. He came out immediately after the RCMP press conference on Thanksgiving Day to give his own. While he's on the stand at the Hague Commission, he calls those who leaked information about China's foreign interference criminals. And then a day or two later, we find out that, the Trudeau government actually gave all this information that they have never made public to the Washington Post in a secret briefing so that they would have the information out there and try and move forward their agenda.
I think there's no doubt that the Trudeau government has used this whole issue as a political wedge. I mean, it's people should go back and look at the tape. He was asked about, Commission Counsel asked him about other parties. And then when he said, well, I don't like to use the inquiry for partisan purposes. And she basically said, okay, well, let's move on. And he went, well, having said that, there are a number of Conservatives who have essentially colluded with foreign powers. And then he went on his rant. And it amazed me that neither the Justice Hogue nor the Council stopped him and said, look, this is not the purpose of this commission.
It was a rant that went on for more than 5 minutes. And I forget the exact time, 5 minutes 30, 5 minutes 40 seconds. It was long. And at the start, the way he used his language was very precise, where he said, and or. So he lumped together people who may have been involved in foreign interference, the witting or unwitting participants, with people who were the targets, like Michael Chong. He lumped them all into one group, made it sound really big, and then went on a diatribe. And you're right, nobody said, well, come on, this is not question period.
Yeah, no, I thought it was pretty unconscionable. I just want to clarify, by the way, because I wrote all this, and the abuse was unbelievable, like traitor, are you getting paid by the Indians? I just want to say categorically, Canada cannot allow what's been going on, which is essentially that the Indian intelligence agencies have been hiring assassins to kill people in Canada.
No,
that is the charge which was in the U.S. indictment, and I think when the RCMP has finished compiling its case, it will present and make public as much as it can about what happened in Canada, and that is the starting point for us to engage with the Indians. Stop this, acknowledge it, and then we can talk about things like deporting potential criminals. I think the Indians are very touchy because they feel that there's some kind of colonial, they've got some kind of, it's almost an inferiority complex. And they feel that the developing countries are basically just ordering them around. Sorry, the developed countries are ordering them around. And they point to the 26 people they want deported. why won't you just deport them? Well, there are human rights considerations. India has not signed the Convention on Torture. Let me clarify. It has signed, it hasn't ratified. And we should be looking at, we in general, the Supreme Court has reiterated the idea that we should be deporting people who are charged in other countries. But that follows on from the point where India stops murdering Canadians in Canada.
Two things can be true at once. We have to stop what the Indian government is doing. But the Trudeau Liberals have also been playing footsies with questionable elements in the Khalistani movement to boost their own electoral fortunes. And, Modi's response, I said that the Khalistani movement is a small subset within the Sikh community in Canada. But Modi's fight with Trudeau, the wider Sikh community does have some sympathy for Trudeau pushing back against Modi.
On that point about not all Sikhs are on side with the Khalistani movement. I talked to Ujjal Dosanjh, who was a liberal health minister, former premier of British Columbia, who is Sikh. He said we could have just after Harper left, this relationship was still in great shape.
Yep,
and we could have grown it, and we've blown it. He said essentially, that there's a small minority of Khalistanis who control the temples and the funding of the temples, which is then rebated to the Liberal Party, and direct people how to vote, essentially. And he says this has been known to the Liberal Party, and they have essentially turned a blind eye to it.
What would you say is the future of the Liberal Party after Justin Trudeau leaves? He has changed it from a party that was the most successful in Western democracies into a movement. I don't think it's too strong to say that it is in ways a cult of personality. The entire party is built around him. And he does call it a movement now. You don't have to sign up a membership form. You don't have to pay money to join. It's a very different party than it was before. And there were some changes to the leadership rules that have folks worried about what comes next. Does Melanie Joly campaign just on the issue of Gaza as a way to win and bring in a pile of new people that are single issue voters on that? Does the Liberal Party become stronger if Trudeau leaves in the next little while, or are they at risk of becoming weaker?
I think they undoubtedly become stronger. He was elected on a mandate of protecting the interests of the middle classes and
those working hard to join it.
Those working hard to join. When you've been successful with a mantra when people repeat it, although it's boring to the press gallery, you hear it 10 times a day. But at some point during the mandate, the focus shifted to interest groups and interest politics, and I think he divined that he could keep winning elections if he just kept moving further and further left. And I think in doing that, he left behind the median voter. Now, there's this theorem, the political science theorem, the median voter theorem. And essentially it says you can't do that. You can't just keep moving further and further from the median voter. And I think on taxation issues and a whole bunch of other issues, he has ignored that and just followed what he's convinced is right, in inverted commas. And I think what we're seeing is a rejection of that by the electorate. And anybody who follows him, who continues down that path, is not going to be successful. And that includes, I think, Chrystia Freeland, and I think it includes Melanie Joly.
So,
appealing to people who support the people of Gaza is not a winning strategy. You look at the polls; Canadians are completely divided.
Let me throw out the names at you and get you a quick analysis of some of the potential leadership candidates. And we'll start. Melanie Joly.
I think there's a constituency for her. She's a Quebecer. She's a female. I mean, I do think there's a feeling that the next Liberal leader should be a woman, which I think is exactly wrong. It should be whoever the best candidate is, not necessarily a Quebecer or a woman or any other qualification other than on merit. But there is a lot of noise being made for her right now, and she seems to be auditioning for the part with her stance on Israel,
and she remains popular
Brian,
in Quebec.
Yeah, Brian, look at the demographics in her writing.
Yes,
as she told Tom Mulcair.
Chrystia Freeland, is she too close to the center right now? Too close to what Canadians are fed up with?
I think so. I mean, how can you? We've seen this down the years when another leader, essentially the second in command, steps up and claims it's not the 10th year of a Trudeau government, it's the first year of a Freeland government. From Gordon Brown to even Paul Martin. I mean, that just has not worked. And I just can't imagine how she could disassociate herself from all the policies that people are fed up with to claim, well, that was nothing to do with me. I mean, it's kind of what Kamala Harris is facing at the moment in the US.
Mark Carney, smart guy in my view, difficult communicating with the average median voter.
Yeah, I guess people would say that. I mean, I know him, and I think he's got more of that than people might give him credit for. I mean, the easy and kind of lazy analogy is Michael Ignatieff. I think he's got more common streak to him and is more political than Ignatieff. But, there's no doubt he's a technocrat, and that might be a turn-off for a lot of Canadians. I do think, though, he would bring the party back to the centre, which is where it needs to be.
Christy Clark is someone that I think would bring the party back to the centre as well. She said that she's interested, but my question about her is the party and the membership still in the centre, or would she be someone who couldn't find a home in the Liberal Party of now?
Well, I think you leaders lead. Otherwise, if you don't have followers, you're just a man or a woman going for a walk. And I think there is still a constituency of Liberals who are fed up with the way that things have gone and feel it's moved too far left and it's too much about interest groups and minority rights and some of these other things. So that, from that point of view, she fits the bill. She doesn't speak very good French, I don't think. She's been in Jonquière learning up in the Saguenay, but I was in Jonquière up in the Saguenay learning French, and it didn't take. So if you can't speak French, you can't lead this country.
And if you haven't heard French with a Scottish accent, I can tell you it's great to listen to. Yeah, maybe not from you. Apparently it didn't take, but it does work.
It's hard. Although it's funny, it always amuses me that at least two of the translators on one of the official translators and one of the on CPAC are both Scottish.
Yes, and lovely to listen to. Do you see anybody else out there? Once upon a time, I had thought Francois Philippe Champagne, aka Frankie Bubbles, was a good contender. I'm not sure anymore. Or do you see him or anybody else being in the mix?
Yeah, I think Francois is a very able communicator. He's relentlessly optimistic. I think he's done some good things. I mean, you can argue about the subsidies being paid for some of these big car plants, but there's no doubt he's established an industry here. People always say, bring up, well, electric vehicles are just not going to take off. Well, go and tell that to Tesla shareholders. I mean, the sales, or GM shareholders, they've seen soaring electric vehicle numbers. So, he should not be counted out. I don't know whether he and Carney would both run, for example. I think they'd be going after the same voters. But he's a Quebecer. He's very able. He's extremely likable. I mean, clearly I'm biased. I'm not the typical Liberal voter. I think if they go even further leftward, they're going down a dead end. But to me, Champagne or Carney or even Christy Clark would be more realistic candidates, people who would take the Liberal Party back to where it needs to be, especially if Poilievre doesn't moderate some of these positions and feels that he has to appeal to the base, and then there's a swathe of red Tories and centrists who feel that they're not being catered to by the incoming government. I mean, that's an opportunity for the Liberal Party.
Of course, if the Liberals go further left, Pierre Poilievre could do what Doug Ford has done and take over all that real estate by appealing to middle-of-the-road voters.
Well, I think he's kind of done that already, but I don't think that vote is solid for him. And that if there was another Liberal leader, he might find that some of it disappears.
John, great talking to you as always. Thanks for the insight.
Great. All the best, Brian.
Full Comment is a Postmedia podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Make sure you subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, what have you. Help us out by giving us a rating or leaving a review, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.